And welcome back to the trial of the nurse Lucy Letby. In this video I'm going to be covering for you the closing speech given by Nicholas Johnson KC on behalf of the prosecution. Mr. Johnson details the case of child J. He says when Letby was giving evidence in this case, she said Band 4 nursery nurses cannot do intensive care, high dependency babies or handling of stomas. Letby said the unit was very busy as an explanation why a Band 4 nurse was caring for child J. Mr. Johnson says the implication of that exchange was to give the impression child J received incompetent care and staffing levels were compromised. Letby had messaged a colleague on November 19th, 2015, quote, "It's shocking really that they are willing to take on responsibility for things they have no training or experience on. Don't think they appreciate the potential difficulties." Mr. Johnson says the jury will remember witnesses had been cross-examined about nursing guidelines. He says the part that was never quoted was the bit about stomas. The care, shown to the court, says special care day nurses can include care of a stoma. Mr. Johnson says that whole evidence was designed to mislead you. Mr. Johnson says child J had no respiratory difficulties, was being bottle fed and did not need respiratory support, having been put in room 4. Nurse Nicola Dennison said child J was getting ready to go home with a stoma by November 26, 2015. She wrote in notes that child J was stable. Child J's mother left at the end of the day, intending to return at 8 AM the following day, but received an emergency call overnight. Letby was in room 3, designated nurse for 2 babies that night shift. Nicola Dennison was the designated nurse for child J and 1 other baby in room 4. Child J desaturated at 4:40 AM on November 27th. Mary Griffith was working in room 2. She said in evidence child J was a joy to look after and described the first desaturation which she and Nicola Dennison both dealt with. The desaturation was alarmingly low. Miss Dennison said after cross-examination, child J collapsed after her feed. Dr. Verhees recorded the shift was busy. Twins had been admitted to room 1 at 6:10 AM. He said he reviewed child J once and all the information was given to him by nursing staff. He noted there had been 2 profound desaturations timed at 5:15 AM. Child J was moved to nursery 2 when the designated nurse was Mary Griffith. Mr. Johnson says Letby was then involved in care of babies in room 2 despite her designated babies being in room 3. Letby had said in her text the unit was closed trying to get someone in. At 6:49 AM she messaged quote, "It's all a bit tits up." Mr. Johnson says resources have been diverted to room 1 and this was the perfect opportunity for Letby to attack child J. At 6:56 AM, child J collapsed. Mary Griffith noted child J's monitor went off at 06:50. Myself and L. Letby attended. Found baby with pale hands and baby very rigid. SATs went to 7 and heart rate to 68. Child J neopuffed with little improvement. Dr. Gibbs on unit and called to help. Neopuff continued for 16 minutes until SATs improved. Mr. Johnson says this was a serious enough incident for the consultant to be called. A glucose bolus was started at 7:20 AM, which Mr. Johnson says was administered by Letby. At 7:40 AM, according to nursing notes, child J desaturated again. Her fists were clenched, her eyes were rolling to the left, and Letby got involved again. Dr. Gibbs recorded at 7:35 AM 2 seizures. He said he remembered Mary Griffith and Lucy Letby were there when he arrived. A seizure was reasonably long, about 10 minutes. Mr. Johnson says prior to these events, child J had never had a seizure and she has not had one since. She recovered very well afterwards. He adds blood tests were normal and showed no signs of infection. A brain scan showed no abnormality, nor in an X-ray. Dr. Gibbs said an oxygen drop was the reason for the seizure, but could not find a reason for the oxygen drop. Dr. Stephen Breary said there was no explanation for the deteriorations. Dr. Evans said there was no marker of infection for child J. He said if there had been, the recovery would not have been so quick. He agreed there had been a lack of oxygen and it had not been an epileptic seizure. Dr. Bowen said babies who are ready to go home do not have collapses which require prolonged resuscitation and a quick recovery. Mr. Johnson says the cause of the collapses bear all the hallmarks of an attack by Lucy Letby. Mr. Johnson said child J was prospering prior to the attacks, and the attack happened while the unit was distracted by 2 emergency admissions. He says at that time, when it was all hands to the pump, Letby was on her phone. He says Letby stopped texting 7 minutes before child J's collapse. Letby's suggestion that she had little memory of the event is not realistic, as that night was punctuated by 2 emergency admissions to the unit. He says Letby was running with the "I don't remember" line to avoid answering questions. He says Letby searched for child J's parents, which is inexplicable other than through an unnatural interest in them. Mr. Johnson moves to the case of child N. He says child N was sabotaged by Lucy Letby as he was getting ready to go home. The first incident was characteristic of Lucy Letby's handiwork, Mr. Johnson says. Her colleague Christopher Booth had gone on a break. Mr. Johnson suggests Letby was in her least favourite room that day, in nursery 4, with only 2 babies, and had time on her hands by texting about Melanie Taylor's shortcomings and a male doctor. He says that includes the "Go Commando" comment, which he says Letby lied about not knowing its meaning. If she's not even prepared to tell you the truth on something so trivial, what is she prepared to tell you the truth about? Mr. Johnson says Letby's interviews are very revealing in relation to the texts in the case of child N. He refers to the 2020 police interview. Letby was asked if she knew child N had haemophilia. She replied she didn't. Mr. Johnson says that was a lie. There was a handover sheet in the Morrison's bag at her home which documented child N had haemophilia. On the 2nd of June 2016, Letby was recorded caring for 2 babies in room 4, including giving a feed to one of the babies, a 50ml feed to a baby who was asleep. Mr. Johnson says it would take 15 to 20 minutes. He says the 2030 time could mean any time between 2015 and 2045. Mr. Johnson says the keypad on Lucy Letby's phone must have been hot, as Letby was texting constantly at this time. He says it is accepted people do text at work, but giving an NG tube feed is a 2-handed process, and you can't do that if you're texting at the same time. He says there are 41 text messages in the conversation, and that cannot be done if you are giving in the proper way an NG tube feed. Mr. Johnson says Letby was asked about this, how it could be done. Letby replied, "It can't." Mr. Johnson had told Letby there was one method of administering a feed quickly. Letby replied, "You think I pushed it in?" Nicholas Johnson replied, "That's what you were doing, wasn't it?" Letby replied, "No." Designated nurse Christopher Booth said for the incident, he went for a break around 1 AM on June 3rd. Sophie Ellis was giving a feed at the time and only had a vague memory of child N and had a number of designated babies that night. Melanie Taylor was making an entry on a fluid balance chart and had no memory of child N. Valerie Thomas was a nursery nurse who would not have been in room 1. Mr. Johnson says the process of elimination was it was Lucy Letby who was in room 1 as she wasn't recorded doing anything at that time. Dr. Jennifer Lockerhan noted child N was unsettled and desaturations had gone to 40%. He was dusky and mottled. He was screaming. Dr. Evans said the 30-minute crying was unusual, as was the speed of the decline. He could think of no naturally occurring or innocent cause. Dr. Bowen said the desaturation was life-threatening and there was nothing to suggest it was an innocent event. There must have been an inflicted painful stimulus to cause a life-threatening collapse. Mr. Johnson says that same kind of injury was inflicted by Letby on child O 20 days later, causing a liver injury. He says this attack happened on a baby who was perfectly well just after the designated nurse had gone on a break. Mr. Johnson is now referring to events on June 15th, 2016. He says the day before, on June 14th, Letby was Child N's designated nurse. It was planned for Child N to go home that week. On June 14th, notes are shown showing Child N had a 45ml feed at 7:40am. At 8:17am, Letby complained she had to feed Child N. She messaged, quote, "bottle not done." Mr. Johnson says the 45ml feed took until about 8:15am. Letby had noted Child N was almost ready for home. Child N's mother fed Child N at 11:50am. Mr. Johnson says Letby noted at 2:20pm, "Mummy visiting this morning, carried out cares and feed, aware that once jaundice treatment discontinued, infants will be ready for home." Mr. Johnson says Letby did something to destabilise Child N at the end of her day shift to give the impression of an underlying problem. Jennifer Jones-Key reported that in the night, Child N was unsettled. She wrote in nursing notes, "At the start of the shift, baby N nursed in incubator with eye protection in situ. Baby very unsettled early part of night." Mr. Johnson asks what had happened to unsettle Child N that night. He says it is similar to the case of Child P just over a week later. Child N started to desaturate at 1am, looking mottled, and it was escalated to Belinda Simcock and Catherine Percival Ward. A male doctor reviewed Child N and noted he looked normal. Swipe data show Letby came in extra early at 7:12am. Mr. Johnson said as soon as she entered, she texted the male doctor, quote, "I've escaped being in room 1, back in room 3. Moments later, Child N collapsed. Mr. Johnson said Jennifer Jones-Key said Child N had fleeting desaturations early in the morning. Mr. Johnson says an observation chart showed no worrying signs at all at 5am and 7am for Child N with 100% oxygen saturation levels. Child N had a big desaturation at 7:15am. He says Letby knew she had a chance to sabotage Child N as it would be busy. A colleague had texted her, quote, 5 admissions, 1 vent. Jennifer Jones-Key said she recalled Letby had gone over and noticed Child N was pale. She said Letby had just come in to say hello as they were friends. Mr. Johnson says Letby had been texting 2 colleagues, not Jennifer Jones-Key, the previous day, and continued the text with a nursing colleague and a doctor colleague up to 7:12am. Mr. Johnson says if she was going in to talk to her friend, she would have gone to the nursing colleague who she had been texting and was on duty. Letby in police interview said she had assumed something had happened for Child N to move because of the observations on the chart. She said she had no independent memory of Child N. The nursing notes suggested Child N was desaturating on handover. Mr. Johnson says the impression given by the note is she was inheriting the problem of the child already desaturating by the time she came on shift. He says Letby was trying to avoid an audit trail. Child N's parents were called in urgently and they saw him being given CPR. The parents recalled Lucy Letby being present. Mr. Johnson says Letby made more misleading notes after this collapse for Child N. Letby noted in family communication at 2:10pm, parents contacted by senior nurse Butterworth during intubation, both phones switched off and no answer on landline, message left, call returned shortly after. Mr. Johnson says that note must refer to the 8am intubation done by a male doctor. His note of intubation drugs given. Mr. Johnson says it had been said the parents' statements were agreed, but now they are not. Child N's father said Lucy Letby rang him up and gave details. He added in response to the phone call, "I didn't get the impression he was still unwell." He said a different nurse rang up 10 minutes later, telling him to go to the hospital as soon as possible. They arrived at 9am. This was on the day Child N was due to go home. Mr. Johnson says if Child N had been a bit unwell during the night, then he was worse now. He says the parents were told Child N was okay, which was not true. He says the parents might just remember the call to tell them there had been an issue with Child N. He says none of this was dealt with when Letby gave evidence to her own counsel. He says when cross-examined, Letby said she believed there was a note by Bernadette Butterworth on family communication. Mr. Johnson says this chapter of evidence is littered with contradiction. He asks why it was played down to the parents that child N was unwell. Mr. Johnson tells the court that when Letby made the call, she would not have known Jennifer Jones-Key had already recorded Letby had been hands-on with child N. In police interview, Letby said she couldn't remember. Mr. Johnson says the nursing note was completely misleading and suggested senior nurse Butterworth had been unable to get through to the father of child N. He says Letby came in early to sabotage child N. He says if someone looked at the records, it would look like Letby had a peripheral role in child N's care that day. A subsequent examination at Alderhay of child N showed he had no abnormality with his airway. Child N was intubated. The male doctor said upon the intubation attempt he saw blood. He couldn't see the source of the blood and said the swelling was unusual. He said in cross-examination, "It must have been unusual for me to see it." He said in cross-examination it was possible the bleed could have been caused by an implement used before the first intubation, but if that was the case, he said he would have noticed blood on the equipment. Dr. Breary said he could not think of any natural cause why child N had collapsed. At 11:29 a.m, Letby messaged, quote, "Small amounts of blood from mouth and 1 mil from NG. Looks like pulmonary bleed on X-ray. Given factor 8, wait and see." Mr. Johnson says Letby was building a narrative. When asked about the 1 mil fresh blood reading on an intensive care chart at 10 a.m. in interview, Letby said she did not remember, and "I don't know what I did." Mr. Johnson said if this reading is true, she would have escalated it to a doctor as the child had haemophilia. He says if it is not true, it is still a point against Letby. Why would she make a note? Mr. Johnson says the jury know it wasn't escalated as there weren't any doctor's notes. Child N's parents came in and left for a break to get something to eat, and at that point child N collapsed. The next event was at 2:59 p.m. when doctors were crashed bleeped to child N. He says it is a repeat of child E with a bleed. Dr. Saladi encountered, quote, "a large swelling at the end of the epiglottis and had never seen this before in a newborn baby. The swelling perplexed Dr. Gibbs as well. Dr. Breary was called in by Dr. Saladi to help. He said they were worried about pulmonary hemorrhage and full intubation was still required. Mr. Johnson says we know now it was not pulmonary hemorrhage. Mr. Johnson says the suggestion Letby first saw blood at this point is completely unconvincing. Mr. Johnson says the text to a doctor colleague by Letby is made at 11:29 a.m, mentioning small amounts of blood from mouth and 1 mil from NG. Another note is made on her family communication. Mr. Johnson says Letby omitted that in interview. He says the truth is Letby made a damaging admission in interview and proves she sabotaged child N before the arrival of a doctor. Quote, "Sorry if I was off during intubation. Bernie winds me up, faffing etc. I like things to be tidy and calm." Mr. Johnson says Bernadette Butterworth was getting on Lucy Letby's nerves that day. Letby recorded another 1 mil of blood at 6 p.m. When the Alderhay transport team arrived, a female doctor said Letby was agitated and approached the doctor saying, "Who are these people? Who are these people?" Mr. Johnson says this is contradictory to what Letby said in interview, when she said she was relieved the transport team arrived. He says this is all part of the gaslighting on her colleagues. The female doctor felt Letby's behaviour was out of character from what she had previously experienced. Dr. Gibbs said at 7:40 p.m. he was discussing matters with the transport team when someone called for help for child N as his saturation levels had dropped. Mr. Johnson asked if this was an innocent coincidence, when all the doctors at the time were distracted in a huddle. Mr. Johnson says thanks to the skill of the medical team, they were able to bring child N back following resuscitation efforts. Child N's time in Alderhay was uneventful and he was discharged 3 days later. Professor Sally Kinsey said the blood seen by the male doctor at 8 a.m. could not have been spontaneous. Somebody caused the bleeding and could not have been seen for the first time hours later by Letby. Mr. Johnson says the person who injured child N was undoubtedly Lucy Letby. Mr. Johnson lists the common events for the babies in this indictment by categorisation. By ones who collapsed despite having good air entry but saturations were dropping, child A, C, D, G, H second event, I third event and fourth event, M, O twice, and child P. By bleeds and or bleeding in the throat, child C, E, G, H, N, plus false note by Letby in the case of child K. Unusual discoloration, child A, B, D, E, I, M, O, H. Suffered life-threatening collapses out of nowhere, then recovered very quickly. Child B, D, H both collapses. Child I events 1 to 3. Child M, N, O, and P. Children who collapsed when designated nurse left or leaving the room. Child C, D, G first event, I second event and fourth event, child K, N first event, child P third collapse when doctors were out of the room, child Q slight variation when Letby got herself out of the room, and premature babies screaming, crying uncharacteristically at the time of collapse. Child D, E, I, and N. Children who collapsed shortly after being visited by their parents. Child B, H, I first event, M, N, O, and child P. Children who recovered quickly when taken to other hospitals. Child H, I after third collapse, child N, and child Q. Mr. Johnson says child K's tube never moved after being transferred out of the Countess. When Letby participated in appropriate post-death behaviours, child C, child I, and child O. Poisoned by insulin, child F and child L. Mr. Johnson says if Letby had not sabotaged 7 babies, they would have all have gone home. The other 10 babies Letby attempted to murder. That concludes the prosecution's closing speech.